Good afternoon and welcome to Bad Ballots and Lost Votes, the Path to a Better Ballot. It's a Brennan Center for Justice event, and we're going to be talking about two very important parts of voting that most of us only spend a few seconds thinking about, maybe every 2 years or every 4 years or however often we actually vote, and that is ballot design, the nitty-gritty of actually casting your vote. My name is Illuminates. I'm a senior reporter at WNYC and the co-host of the podcast Trump Inc. from WNYC and ProPublica, and I'm going to be your moderator of this program. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with New York University's School of Law, and their partners for this event are NYU's John Bradamus Center, which advocates for civil debate on politics and public policy, and also NYU Votes, which strives to give every eligible NYU student the information they need to cast their ballot. Please visit nyu.edu/nyu-votes for lots of resources about registering and voting. Now, after all the stuff that goes into an election are over, the rallies and the advertisements and the debates, each election comes down to one thing, and that is the ballot. And throughout American history, ballot design and election administration have been contested ground. In our lifetimes, we had butterfly ballots and hanging chad, a design failed that threw the results of the 2000 presidential election into doubt. Reach further back into history and you'll see that ballot problems are not always accidental and they don't hit everyone equally. But as we'll see, presenting choices to voters visually also isn't so simple. So let's talk about it now with two Brennan Center election law specialists. Larry Norden is the director of the Election Reform and Democracy Programs at the Brennan Center. Victoria Vassetti is a Brennan Center fellow and the author of Electoral Dysfunction, a survival manual for American voters. We are also joined by Alicia Cheng. She is a graphic designer and founding partner of Management Design based in Brooklyn, an external critic at Rhode Island School of Design, and she's taught at the Cooper Union, Yale, and Maryland Institute College of Art. And what's really exciting about talking with Alicia today is she just published a book called This Is What Democracy Looked Like, all about the history of American ballot design. One more thing before we start the conversation, I want to invite all of you who are joining this virtual event to share your questions. You can type them into the Q&A box. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom page, there's a little Q&A box. So just type in your questions there and we will start taking as many of those as we can a little bit later in the program. So if everyone is here, I want to ask Alicia first to start us off. You have completed this book on the history of ballot design in the US. This Is What Democracy Looked Like. It's from Princeton Architectural Press. Can you actually show us what voting used to look like in this country? How different did it look from what we are accustomed to today?
Very different. And first, I want to thank everyone for joining the event today. And I want to extend my gratitude also to the Brennan Center for coordinating this event. It takes a cast of many to coordinate the production of this. So I appreciate everybody's technical help. So yeah, the book, which is physically looks like this. It's very bright, you can't miss it on the bookshelf. But I would say, while I appreciate the fact that it sounds like I've done a comprehensive timeline of ballot design from the dawn of time, it was really more sort of the things that I found in chronological order. So if that serves as some kind of timeline in a way. So it's not the be all end all, because ballots are, one collector called them the most fugitive ephemera. They're hard to find. They're not supposed to be kept for many legal reasons. So that's why this endeavor started as something that was just sort of like one little inkling of curiosity that sort of blossomed into many other factors about how we cast our votes. But today I'd like to show you just sort of a brief whiz through some of the images that are in the book, and I'll share screen now. And then we'll lead it into slides that Victoria and Larry can speak to also, and then have a general discussion. So bear with me. Yes, this group knows exactly what I'm dealing with. The book is called This Is What Democracy Looked Like, in specifically past tense. So I call it a visual history because we're really dealing with sort of the visual artifacts of this method of giving your voice as a citizen. So in the early 1800s, this is an example of a ballot from 1827 where the official ballot was printed not by the government to mark your choice, but instead distributed, maybe with the printed offices, but you would handwrite in your name of and candidate of preference, which, you know, on a scale back then was still manageable. Or you were handed a bunch of, say, smaller ballots like these, which were pre-printed for the voter to submit. So these are the offices on the front and the names on the back. You know, lots of emblems had emblems or signifiers at the top. They were used as a party brand, but also a device to help less literate voters. It's a lot easier to tell someone to vote for the ship or the chicken, or the sort of weird Dr. Seuss-like tree in the middle there. Other ballots had more like shocking illustrations. There are some examples here of ballots for parties based on explicitly anti-immigration and anti-Chinese platforms, more around the late 1880s. You know, the one below calls for protection to white labor and home industry, and then one above to the right, you know, the Chinaman with his queue getting booted back from California. This one from Mississippi, 1868, was a few years after Lincoln was assassinated. And you can see this particular citizen put a line through every option on the ballot. It's a very explicit example of voter intent and free expression even back then. You know, if it's for Constitution, it was against. So every name gets a line through. So in a way, we can see this as an early indicator of where that write-in area in today's ballots are. If you wondered about that, this is sort of a good example of an early manifestation of that. So as I was casting about doing research, and to me, it was really just sort of happening upon different library collections. It wasn't necessarily that I was looking for specific elections to see what the ballots look like. But I came across these, which I learned were called pasters. These are small slips of paper that had sort of a gummed adhesive on the back and were distributed either at the polling place or to voters directly, where they could paste over these names on top of the pre-printed names that they saw on the ballot. So this was so intriguing, and this example from the New York Public Library was an amazing find because they were in such great condition. But then I found these examples of some like literally manhandled ballots, you know, cut and pasted and totally worked over, scratched out, cut out, pasted over. So imagine that type of like sort of craft work that you would have to do going to the polling place. And then seeing the pasters were applied to those ballots were one thing, and then I started seeing examples like this, where it all looks like a sort of standardized letterpress form, but then the bottom names like Edward Flattery in this curvy S is just kind of wacko, and there's no real reason for it. But then I kind of realized, oh, maybe it's sort of like a typographic countermeasure against people who are trying to write over and cut out. It's a lot harder to cut on a curve. And here's a good example of a paster used directly on top of a curved typography. You know, it's totally worth remembering that this wasn't just sort of an isolated research into the ballot as a thread throughout, that the nature of the ballot artifact and its manifestation reflected directly with the conditions by which it was operating. So in the 19th century, the number of people with voting rights was hugely expanded, the population was exploding, there was just a lot to manage and a lot to distribute, and imagine how the system needed to support this growing republic. So with all the partisanship, you had not just our two-party system, obviously one remembers more, but here are other ballots that are like the cactus ticket that no one's really heard of, or the Argonaut, or the anti-boss ticket, all with very vivid emblems to illustrate them. So then this is an example of a dramatic shift that happened around the late 1880s. So this is what is referred to as a blanket ballot, but also an Australian ballot format, because it was originated in Tasmania. So this was radical in many ways because not only were the ballots no longer produced by the political parties themselves, but it was produced by the government. So it was regulated and official. That's a big deal. All the candidate choices were consolidated onto one ballot, also a big deal. Like imagine that that format was all independent, so it's consolidated. But the biggest thing I think that seems more, it's a dramatic shift that goes from voting as a public act to a private act where this ballot was cast in secret. So I think that's another huge thing that a lot of regular citizens kind of take for granted now, that, you know, all those ballots that I showed were ones that you took physically to put in the box with everyone seeing you do it, which is why they were often very flamboyant and, you know, colorful. And there's many other examples I can show, but that's why you should look at it in the book. So, you know, this wasn't a huge hit when it was introduced, even though it was sort of more egalitarian. It just sort of introduced other ways to sort of manipulate the system. Critics said it would, you know, inspire voter fatigue. It would vex the voter. I mean, I would be vexed if I had to deal with this too. But just to say that this became a radical shift in how ballots looked and how the way we conducted ourselves on election day. Here's a ballot, again, organized by office, but now you see these little emblems next to the names. Some are affiliated more, candidates are affiliated with more than one party. So you see how they're sort of triple affiliations, but then they're filling in all the empty spaces with what, letterpress printer called dingbats, so it's like sort of little typographic filler. And this one just has like bizarre enigmatic geometry showing their affiliations and how some candidates were represented with more than one party. So it's graphic artifacts. It was just so intriguing because it wasn't one solution that then, each state would try to regulate, but there was so much room for expression. So things got really bonkers when I came across this state ballot from 1912. So this ballot measures 14 feet long and contains nearly 600 names organized by like state and district committees. So clearly the system was getting, again, way out of hand, and reform measures were calling for something called the short ballot movement. And so, thereafter the book sort of drops off because the ballots just become like just super boring and not half as interesting. But that ends sort of this timeline, and the next slide will be two types of ballots that I think will be interesting. Victoria can speak to how they sort of bookend our condition now.
Thanks, Alicia. So I'm Victoria Vassetti, a fellow at the Brennan Center, and I had the real pleasure of working with Alicia as she was preparing her book. And I wanted to talk really just about these two ballots. As kind of Alicia really indicated, our ballots reflect American ingenuity and enthusiasm, and also our anxieties about election and about democracy. And these two ballots, I think, are really emblematic of those fears and concerns. On the left-hand side, you see something called the official war ballot. And I think that's a perfect example of the opposite of the title of this webinar. That is a good ballot that saved votes. It is a ballot that was issued in 1944 when America was in the midst of World War II. Literally millions upon millions of service people were scattered throughout the globe. And America, with its pride in its democracy, was determined somehow or another to have its service people able to vote. So where we might have sensed that there were pressures in the midst of, the largest war that the world had ever seen, there might have been pressures to send food or materiel to the soldiers. But in addition to that, America made it a priority to send them ballots. And that's what you see there on the left-hand side. And in consequence, more than 4.4 million ballots were received from all corners of the globe in the 1944 presidential election, because America brought its ingenuity, its enthusiasm, and its pride in its democracy to bear upon ballots and upon voting. On the right-hand side, on the other hand, you see a ballot which is pretty. It's kind of typographically interesting. And I think what it also represents, though, is where American democracy began to fell apart. And it's an 1876 ballot. And that was the most hotly contested, possibly also one of the most violent elections, presidential elections, that the United States ever undertook. As this ballot represents essentially the collapsed presidential election of 1876, when, as a result of the violence and intimidation in 3 southern states, rival contested slates of electors were sent to Washington, and in consequence, no one was able to be elected president. The entire election was sent to Congress, where it languished in a committee over a course of months. We were getting closer and closer to Inauguration Day, and there was no president who had been selected. And finally, in a backroom deal, in the classic smoke-filled room, Rutherford B. Hayes was selected president of the United States, and the Compromise of 1877 was executed, which, amongst other things, led to the end of Reconstruction in the South and the end of the Civil War. So I think that these two ballots are sort of emblematic in some ways of the choices about democracy that we face today in 2020. And it's shocking and surprising how much you can learn from looking at a ballot that's, well over 150 years old, or another ballot that's 80 years old, and how much it tells us about ballot design and about democracy today. But I'm really the bridge to modern ballots and the kind of ballots that we're likely to be seeing in 2020. And Larry's going to talk about that.
Thanks, Victoria. Like Victoria, I found Alicia's book fascinating, and she only kind of gave a small flavor in that slideshow of the variety of ballots over the course of history of the U.S. And it really is a kind of reflection of where we were. The ballots that I'm going to show you now that are on the screen and not nearly as probably interesting to look at as what Alicia went through are two examples of the ballots of the modern era. And for the Brennan Center, a lot of our work around ballots is really about how ballots can act as a barrier to people to have their voices being heard. We worked a lot on trying to reduce barriers to the franchise. And the ballot may be the last place where all the hoops that somebody gets through to finally cast their vote. And unfortunately, if it's done poorly, it can mean that the person who went through all that effort, their voice ended up not getting heard. And in fact, something that we've seen in our study of this issue is many of the groups that are disproportionately impacted by other barriers, whether it's voter ID, shutting down polling places, reducing early voting, African-American voters, Latino voters, new voters. Those voters are also impacted by poor design. So I have two examples here. They both happen to be from Florida. It's not only Florida that has ballot design problems, but Florida has a lot of really close elections. So when they do have poor ballot design that disenfranchises voters, it can actually change the outcome of an election. 2000 is the most famous. I have two more examples here. And they I think reflect something that Alicia talked about, excuse me, that there are a lot of factors that go into the way a ballot looks. And so it's not necessarily because somebody's deliberately designing a poor ballot that will confuse people. There are often other factors that come into play. So this first example that I have here was in a congressional race in Florida. It was extremely close. It was decided by 369 votes. This ballot appeared on a touchscreen machine. And as you can see, it was easy to miss the congressional race, which is the one on top. They violated a basic rule of usability for ballots on touchscreen machines. They had two contests on one screen. And the top contest there almost looks like a banner that you would skip. The governor's race has a highlight there in blue, and so the eye is drawn down. And the result was that about 14% of people missed this contest in Sarasota County, which added up to something like 18,000 votes, far exceeded the narrow margin of victory in that contest. The second one is a paper ballot. So really we have two ways of voting in the United States, either on touchscreens or on paper ballots, whether it's mail ballots or ballots in person. You can get designs that confuse, obviously, people in both cases. This paper ballot is from the Senate race in 2018 between Senator Nelson and Governor Scott. Again, extremely close contest. Here, the election official who designed this ballot kind of went off script. Florida has a template. Usually the instructions are supposed to be up top. She decided that because she wanted to include three languages, English, Spanish, and French Creole, part of this was the English and Spanish was a requirement under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. I think she added French Creole because even though it wasn't required, there are a lot of Haitian voters in Broward County. She put them on the side, and then to try to fit every contest in, she stuck the Senate race right below it. Now, of course, most people don't read instructions on a ballot. They just go and vote. And so even if they did go through even if a voter did go through, let's say, the English, instructions, their eye would immediately be drawn to the right. That's how we read left to right. It's, many voters would not go through all 3 languages going down and then continue to the next contest. So in retrospect, it's not all that surprising that a decent number of people that were voting this ballot missed that contest in the lower left, which was a Senate race. Those votes, a very large percentage of those votes probably would have gone to Senator Nelson. Broward County is a heavily Democratic county. So it seems there too that this, what I would call a ballot design mistake, may have had a huge impact on that contest and actually been the difference between Nelson and Scott in 2018 winning. So all that is to say, ballot design matters in many ways, but one way for sure is it can actually impact outcomes of elections. It impacts who gets heard. I do think that for me, the thing that I love about dealing with the issue of ballot design is it's a very fixable problem. It's something that there's been a lot of study on, and the changes that need to be made to ensure that the most voters that are participating are heard are fairly straightforward. So anyway, I'll leave it at that, Ilya, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Larry. And I see questions are starting to come in from people listening in the Q&A box. Please feel free to add your questions now. I'll be asking your questions of the panelists pretty soon. Victoria, one thing I didn't really realize until I read your contribution to Alicia's book is that spoiled ballots, uncounted ballots, ballots that never got fully filled out is probably a much bigger problem in this country than voter fraud, which we hear so much about. Can you give me some sense of the size of the problem of ballot design basically impacting votes?
Well, so in addition to the what Larry just spoke about, which was the kind of the situation where the ballot design leads to people just literally skipping over a race, right? We also have other kind of instances of voter intent being unclear. Instances where voters, for example, might initially circle something in and then change their mind and try to fix it, leading to, like an inability to understand what did the voter actually intend to do in that race, or other cases where they do an X mark rather than fully fill in the little bubble, and all of those mount and mount and mount, and literally can amount to thousands of votes in one individual precinct. Roll it up and it can be even more votes across the United States, where essentially because the voter intent wasn't perfectly expressed, or because the voter was unclear, they spoil the ballot. And it can have really quite dramatic effects. It can also lead to, in really close cases where a recount occurs, it can lead to exactly those sort of scenes that you've seen before in the kind of the butterfly ballot or the hanging chad sort of era, where you've got like 10 people over a desk looking at one ballot to try to figure out whether or not it was spoiled, whether or not the voter intent was clear, and literally hundreds of lawyers poring over each ballot when there's a contested recount. Those are the contested recounts only occur obviously in the cases where the vote was close enough that a losing candidate has the opportunity to contest it and ask for a recount. If that's not the case, literally there can be thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of spoiled ballots every year.
And Alicia, you come at this from a design perspective. What are some of the obstacles to clearly presenting the information to voters that they need to know so that they can make a choice in the privacy of the ballot box or wherever they make that choice?
Well, Larry mentioned, the actual design of the ballot, not to diminish it, I totally feel that designer who needed to fit everything in, in the name of efficiency, trying to sort of do a layout that best suited the terms that they had facing them and the conditions. But, if the work that the Brennan Center and Center for Civic Design have been doing to sort of create these sort of very simple toolkits for any election official to be able to, like, you know, create better signage, create sort of different, very simple rules they can follow. So it's not so much about sort of picking the perfect typeface and layout choices that are obviously part of the actual layout and design of the ballot itself, but it's sort of the process by which they get produced and signed and people are led to that moment. And so then when they're at that moment of choice, they're able to do it very clearly. I mean, you know, it's like what people say UX and UI in terms of like the touchscreen organization and what draws your eye. It's like if we got sort of Google people and engineers to think that through, it is kind of an easier problem than the bigger issues in terms of access and, you know, disenfranchisement that is all part of this whole process.
And Larry, we know that bad ballot design is bad for all voters, but it doesn't hit all voters equally. So what can you tell me about who is disadvantaged when bad ballot design surfaces?
Yeah, so I made brief mention to this in my remarks, but there's no question that if you look at the numbers disproportionately, and this shouldn't be all that surprising, new voters, people who haven't voted before, are impacted by poor design. We find voters, Black and Latino voters, often are disproportionately impacted. So in that Broward County example, that was it happened that the precincts that were really affected by that design were African American. They happened for various reasons to probably get the worst design ballot in the entire county. And sometimes older voters too are disproportionately impacted, and we certainly saw that in Palm Beach County, where voters over 65 were probably disproportionately impacted. I would just add a couple of points to what Victoria said about design and this moment, this election that we're facing. We're going to have a lot of new voters in this election. I don't just mean like people voting for the first time. We're going to have a lot of people that are voting in a way that they never did before, right? A lot of people are going to be voting by mail for the first time because of COVID. And that probably means design matters more in this election than it has in a long time. People design for the envelopes that people have to fill out, the instructions, but they understand what they're doing when they're filling it out. If you make a mistake in a polling place on a paper ballot and the machine can't read it, usually you'll get some kind of notification. You're not going to get that notification if you're filling it out at home. So having a good design and paying attention to design in this election is going to be particularly important.
Victoria, please jump in.
You know, I was going to jump in because I think in the latest election that New York held, where there were a lot of mail-in ballots, there was a fair number of, I mean, I think it was in the 70,000 ballots that were disqualified, mail-in ballots that were disqualified. A lot of them because they were late, but there were quite a few that were disqualified because of kind of incorrectly filling out the envelope, or because the voter intent was unclear. So that's a evidence of the scope of the problem that we may be facing from kind of, I'm not sure if bad ballot design is the right word, but inept ballot design, or kind of failure to fully kind of think through the user experience of this ballot.
I feel like it's so much about that user experience, but also, I mean, I would just sort of reframe, everyone's talking about ballot design, but I always see that word, and maybe as a designer, it's sort of, I refer to it more like with a capital D. It's like design of the whole system of how the ballot gets to the voter. So as Larry was saying, like make sure the envelope like fits the ballot. I know that was an issue. Make sure that there was enough printers who can print them. Like, we're talking about a fabrication distribution problem too. So, it is that piece of paper, but it's sort of how that piece of paper gets to you as well. So it's sort of all aspects of the process and the system that need to be thought of as design.
And I guess in America, when we vote, typically we're voting in a way that has been designed by local authorities, local boards of elections, or perhaps in some instances state, but in any case, there's not a uniform standard. And my supposition from voting in New York for many years is that terms like UX and UI are not top of mind necessarily, at least for the New York City Board of Elections. They may not even know what those mean. I barely know what those mean. They're user interface and user experience. So Larry, can you give us some sense of who's actually making those decisions this year about how people are going to vote?
Yeah, well, first of all, I should say, you know, and Alicia alluded to this a little bit. You have laws that are in place so it's the election official that is designing this ballot. It's the county. It's generally at the county level. There may be state templates that are provided, but everybody's got to comply with the law. And in New York State, we have some crazy requirements for what has to be on the ballot, because when legislators wrote these laws, they weren't thinking about what is this going to end up looking like. That's not their first concern to the voter. And then you have the machinery that either reads the ballot or displays the ballot or prints the ballot. And you've got to be able to, as an election official, comply with all of that. And so the example that I showed in Sarasota County with the kind of banner of the congressional race on top and the governor's race below, that was the default of the machine. So the election official, that wasn't top of mind for her. So she just went to the default, didn't do usability testing to see what that would mean for the voters. So I think, you know, so it's generally the county election official that's in charge. But when they're putting together the ballot, I don't want to say they're not thinking about what the user experience is going to be, but they've got to be thinking about a lot of other things, like what is the machine going to be able to handle? What laws do I have to comply with first before they get to that question? And all under like really tight time frame.
I was going to say one of my favorite things about New York's election laws on its ballot is that the New York law still requires to print a little hand on it. So just like this cute little artifact of the 19th century, you know, the hand saying here, and it's actually a law that the county clerk has to comply with when they're kind of creating the ballot.
And I have to say that reading through the specifications that were penned in like, you know, early 1900s is like a total snooze. But yes, it is that level of like black ink, white paper, bright white, not warm white, you know, certain wove. So like really trying to hammer out all these potential for interpretation. But yeah, in terms of like how big the square should be, et cetera. But that also, just to go back to a little history lesson too, is that how the printers were able to produce it back then with letterpress sorts, right? Those little punches. The catalogs for what you had to choose from is also awesome, because you just get the different size squares, you get different chickens for the Democratic Party. And so it is from that catalog. So I guess it's the same kind of thing we're all talking about in terms of how things get executed. And at every juncture, sort of also considering, you know, the means by which they get executed. So
yeah. And Larry, I think something like 10,000 electoral districts, or there's a different count. So you've literally got 10,000 variations on the ballot. You know.
Potentially, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And is that a good thing or a bad thing, that variety?
We're all individuals in our.
It's American democracy. It's,
yeah, exactly.
You know, we just elect so many different kind of groups of people in different districts, you know, all at one time. So you've got to have a ballot that's very kind of geographically precise, sometimes down to a, you know, like only a, you know, 15 or 20 square block area gets its own distinct ballot, because that 15 or 20 square block area, in addition to electing president, is also electing, you know, kind of a district leader.
So I've been reading a lot of punditry about what could happen in November, particularly if the presidential election appears to be close, and President Trump has been casting doubt on the validity of mail-in ballots and whether they can be trusted. And, you know, all the punditry I'm seeing is from people who don't study the mechanics of elections. But Victoria and Larry, you do. And Alicia, in your own way, you do too. So I want to ask all three of you, are we heading for a disaster?
I don't want to answer that. I think Larry should first.
Look, I think, unfortunately, the primaries gave us some sense of the problems that we might see in November. To me, there are a lot of potential nightmare scenarios, but many of them boil down to the fact that leaving the president and his comments and a lot of disinformation aside, that's a big thing to leave aside. We're having a different election this year than anybody would have expected in January or February. And by that, I don't mean the candidates. I just mean everybody was, preparing for an election where most people voted in person. And the pandemic upended everything. It upended how people are getting their ballots, how they're going to cast them, what polling places look like, because we have to keep social distancing, and many, many other things. And what I have seen in the primaries, most of all, is just election officials being overwhelmed by that change and not having the resources to address it. So, there's been talk of additional federal money to go to localities to deal with some of these things, to hire more people. Like one of the issues in New York, for instance, was I just think they didn't have enough people to process mail ballots and to count them. That's one reason why it took so long. There are other reasons too, but I think it's still an open question, at least on that part, and I think that's really going to tell us how much of a mess this election is going to be, as to whether or not we're going to get more resources to states and these 10,000 counties that are and towns that are running elections, so that they can make a lot of the changes that they should be making for November.
Victoria, your nightmare scenario?
So, that's sort of why I wanted to show those two slides of 1944 and 1876, because in 1944, there was a kind of a real unity of vision and a determination and a patience about democracy. There were resources that were put to it. And in 1876, it was hotly contested. It was confused. And I worry sometimes that kind of in the absence of that unity of vision that we had in 1944, we're headed a little bit more towards 1876. Mm-hmm. I think the one thing that we can sort of confidently predict is there's going to be a lot of litigation. I think it is going to be a contested election. Every single one of the little kind of hiccups or major road bumps or major problems that we're likely to see in this election are going to be hotly contested in the courts. And I think that like Larry said, the vast majority of election administrators are really trying to count the votes. That is genuinely what they're trying to do. They're overwhelmed with a system now that has so many inputs coming at them at once that it's just going to be a kind of a brew of being overwhelmed, of being perhaps not the best graphic designer in the world, combined with the massive amount of political pressure, the massive amount of media pressure, massive amount of litigation pressure. It's going to be complex, contested, and difficult. And the question is whether or not we can kind of regain that patience and unity of vision that we had in 1944 and go a little bit more in that direction.
Let's take some questions. Wait, did you change your mind, Alicia? Do you want to
No, I mean, I
prognosticate?
have nothing at all. I mean, I defer absolutely to my Brady Bunch squares over here to talk about the current condition. But just to say that it's sort of this project started in 2016 as a response to the election result and sort of trying to sort of find some solace in history in terms of surely our country has survived something akin to this. And so, my answer at the end was sort of just barely, but not to sugarcoat anything, but just to say witnessing and sort of, learning in a self-taught way about all the conditions that our early electoral processes were trying to accommodate with, significant fraud and illiteracy and, Reconstruction and all of that. You kind of appreciate that the functionality, and I use that in quotes now, of our system is kind of a miracle for the scale that we need to deal with. So in that way, I say to people who are just outright angry and the ballots are ugly and dysfunctional, everyone needs to take a breath because it's already, everyone's trying to do the best that they can. So not to say that we can't be frustrated, but just sort of looking back in history, like it was even worse before.
So let's take some questions. They're starting to come in. You can type in your questions at the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. And actually, I think this is a good one for you, Alicia. Have you had a chance to look at ballots from around the world? How do they compare to ours historically?
I've been getting that question quite a bit, and somebody was suggesting like volume 2, so I should talk to my publisher about it. I actually mindfully tried to keep it to domestic US because it was just getting too distracting to look at other ballots in other countries. But I will say that I happened to be in Amsterdam for a municipal election and got to go in to sort of see their polling place, and it was like a designer's like dream come true. Everything was just like super clear, really well designed, and so it was just sort of like this sort of waking fantasy of how it could be. So, but yeah, I mean, I'd love to expand the research, so we'll see if that's coming up.
We also have a lot of audience members who are curious about ballot design creation and sort of specifically who is in charge of that design and then approving the ballots and the accountability process, I suppose, if there is going to be accountability afterwards. Victoria, Larry, does one of you want to take that?
Victoria, you may have more to say about this. I mean, the answer in U.S. elections, it depends, because we do have so many thousands of election jurisdictions. But in general, the ultimate responsibility comes down to the county clerk. So, as I said, sometimes like states have templates that leaves the counties with not much flexibility, but generally it's the county clerk. There may be somebody in the office that's responsible for providing the first draft. It's possible in some counties that there's like a vote of the board to approve the ballots. But ultimately it's going to be the head official in the county or the town, whatever the jurisdiction is, that's approving the ballot. Sometimes there may be an opportunity for public input, for public comments, but I would say probably most often that is not the case. The Brennan Center certainly tries to get an advanced look at ballots when we can so that we can comment and spot problems.
And we had a question about accountability. Does that ever happen afterwards if there was a bad design? Does the official in charge ever get removed from their job, or at least are they subject to some kind of process?
Go ahead, Victoria, I don't know if you want
to. Occasionally, right? And it seems to be related to, it seems to be related to situations where the design has gone really badly wrong. I think in, Larry, if I'm right, in Palm Beach, that example that you gave from 2018, the election administrator there was ultimately removed.
in Broward County.
In Broward County, sorry, not Palm Beach.
There are a lot of other problems in that election, but yes.
Yeah. So it seems to be only in the kind of extreme examples that I know of, but I only really know anecdotally rather than systematically.
I mean, often these are elected positions. So, you know, I think, unfortunately, we only hear about really problematic designs when it's a really close election. So the Broward County example, probably nobody would know about if that was, you know, if that election was decided by 2 or 3%. But certainly, you know, I don't envy election officials. They're doing so much. Often they're like, it's often an office of one person, them, and they have like 5 other jobs. But I do think, you know, it's not a fun place to be in if you're in the situation that the election official was in Broward County, where, you know, in all sympathy, I think she was trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. Why I am sympathetic with her in a way too. But, you know, I think it's interesting too that these poor county clerks are also being like art directors for whatever person doing the layout. So, you know, I hope that I can corral my army of graphic designers who are eager to help and sort of join forces and distribute themselves to offer just their, you know, visual services in an effort to sort of offset the tremendous load that's being put upon these municipal officers.
We have a question about something called the short ballot movement, and that's unfamiliar to me, but I bet that you guys have heard of it. Do you know how that was received by ballot designers? Can you explain what the idea behind the short ballot movement is?
Well, this is part of something I came across in my research with a lot of sort of ballot reform movements that started happening as a response to sort of rampant corruption. You know, you can imagine sort of the Boss Tweed era and those testimonies that he's like explicitly stealing the vote. So it inspired this a lot of different variations of people sort of suggesting different reforms. So the short ballot movement was he was kind of a wacko sort of civic organizer, but that was his initiative. But there were many of them, so it wasn't the only one. But you know, people have also asked me who designed the ballots that we saw some sample of here. I don't know. They're not been authored the way that design today is very authored. Like it's probably the printer sort of organizing it based on, and you know, not dissimilar from now. It's probably the county clerk saying somebody make this layout now, and they'll follow all these different rules, and you get what you get. So there is no such thing, I think, as a ballot designer. Although clearly, I think I'm really heartened by this election too, that people are really looking at ballot design and ballot designers. So I think that's something hopeful to hopefully apply in time.
Here's another question. Many election officials are understaffed and underfunded. What is the administrative and financial burden on election offices that are considering updating their ballot materials? And crucially, is there time to make changes less than 100 days away from November 3rd? Victoria?
Oh, I think Larry's really the one to answer this one.
Is there time to make changes?
Yeah, I mean, the ballots themselves haven't been, in most places, they're not finalized yet because the primaries are just ending. What they're going to look like, we hopefully will get some sense in the next few weeks as the ballots themselves are finalized. You know, in terms of the financial stress that elections jurisdictions are facing, it's huge right now. For the reasons that I said, it's always bad. They're always under huge financial stress, and now they're running an election, a second election that they didn't expect to, in addition to or third. You know, they're going to have to do more early voting. They're going to have to rethink what their polling places look like. They're going to have to print all these mail ballots that they weren't expecting to print and get them out and do public education. So they're facing massive burdens, yeah, that's why I think some federal funding is so important right now. But I do think that, you know, it's under those times of like huge stress where something like ballot design kind of gets put towards the bottom in terms of focus. There's just not a lot of time. And the time between when election officials find out who the slate of candidates that are running and when they have to design that ballot is like super short. It's just a matter of weeks. I mean, I think most people realize this, but like the election's November 3rd, but ballots are going to be going out basically in a month to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
Larry,
one thing I add is that election administration is chronically in a certain kind of budget crunch. You know, election administrators are in competition for county funds for sewage and water. And you know, you only hold an election maybe 2 or 3 times a year, but you go to the library all the time, or you go to the parks all the time, and so they're in always in a competition for those funds, and it's one of the things that kind of leads to the chronic underfunding of election administration.
Larry, I know you and NYU the Brennan Center make yourself a resource for local election offices that have questions and want advice. What kind of things are you hearing from them right now?
Mostly we're just hearing that they're overwhelmed. I mean, there's, you know, Victoria mentioned some of this, and Alicia did too, but like election officials, what their job has become in the past few years has really changed. So they're now dealing with the threat of cyber attacks from foreign nation states. They're kind of the front line of that. They've in the past year had to figure out how to run a completely new election and kind of build up an infrastructure that lets people not just many more people cast votes by mail, which is going to happen, but also in terms of how they register, because a lot of people now have to do that online. They're not going to government offices. There are no registration drives. So I don't think there's any question right now that election officials are kind of feeling overwhelmed by the challenges. They're not a group to complain a lot, but they're up against a lot over the next few months for sure.
Here's another question. Is there anything regular people can do to help?
Vic, I think you should share the resources that we talked about at the other event.
Oh,
Or
well,
other.
yeah. So obviously there are a variety of things that people can do. In terms of the actual ballot design, that's sort of a hard question. There's not a lot of opportunity for kind of people to go in and pre-inspect a ballot and provide feedback and sort of say, no, you need to move this box over here or fix this or that. That's not something that happens. On the other hand, I think people who want to kind of help voters on election day and in beforehand, there are a lot of organizations out there, in addition to the Brennan Center, that allow and kind of help administer voter assistance. I know Larry and I have both taken part in the Lawyers Committee Voter Protection Initiative, which I think is 1-866 Our Vote.
Right.
And Larry and I both have in previous years, manned phone banks at taking calls from people who are either confused about where to go vote or how the ballot was done, or have the polling station was unexpectedly closed, or they're also, it's amazing the number of questions you get, and you do leave at the end of the day feeling like you actually helped people vote, which is a very satisfying thing. Larry maybe has some other things, and obviously supporting the Brennan Center's work in doing this is another way you can help.
I would also say that, and Larry, you introduced me to Whitney at the Center for Civic Design, but as I said, I know a lot of graphic designers who are eager to deploy their talents. So, I think generally though, backing out and saying you can volunteer your presence and your brain, and, if it is just counting ballots, no matter what your background, I think that will always help. But, clearly, I'm not going to say it's too late, but there's such a spotlight on how critical ballot design is, and how it obviously rests with people who that's not their forte and they've got other things to deal with. So I hope to sort of figure out ways where things can get built in so that the design, I don't know if it's outsourced or built into the system in some way that is just a graphic designer dealing with that problem. That seems to be another kind of easy fix, but as part of the system. So, but for now, I wish there was like a way you can sign up and have county clerks sort of draw from a pool of volunteers. But if that's, maybe I'll just start one right now. I've got
That's a great idea. So we have another question from one of our participants. Are there any good examples of ballot design? And maybe I'll tack something onto that. Is there any place in the country that consistently has done really good work in making voting simple and fair and accessible?
Well,
this is for anyone.
I mean, I would just build on what Alicia just mentioned, this group, the Center for Civic Design. I would go to their website if you're interested in this, and they've been working with a lot of states on redesigning their ballots, on redesigning their mail ballot forms, secret envelopes that go with them, instructions, poll worker manuals. That's another thing, by the way, anybody can do and should do is if they're comfortable doing it. Obviously, some people will not be with it, but being poll workers is hugely important. But I would say go to Center for Civic Design, and there you can see a lot of states have adopted their best practices for design. I think they're beautiful. They're much more beautiful than the images I showed you of the ballots in Florida, and do a pretty good job of capturing the intent of the voter.
And how about you, Alicia or Victoria? Any place that you want to highlight their work because they really are doing a good job?
Amsterdam? No, just kidding. No, but I remember asking Larry the question.
Canadian ballots have been pretty good.
Which is that?
Canadians.
Yeah, the domestic examples are harder. But I remember asking Larry this, and you mentioned LA. There were some races there that were, we were talking about sort of a touch screen and machinery, and so there are moments of hope. And
yeah, they're never going to be as pretty and interesting as those 19th century ballots, though.
Well, that's for sure.
It's very, kind of white paper, black typeface. You know, it's just, it's very, very boring now, but probably much more effective.
Right. It's about
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to bring people in a little bit on your process, Alicia. When we spoke earlier, you were talking about doing the research and showing up at some of these libraries and research institutes, and they would just give you a box full of paper. And I think you described it as like Christmas.
It was amazing. I mean, I visited the Huntington Library and American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Mass, and New York Public Library, and then Smithsonian in DC. But just to say that, you know, I was sort of following my nose in terms of just asking broadly for examples of printed ballot, which was often couched within sort of larger political ephemera kind of collections. But sort of the act of going and seeing these artifacts in person was really, can't be, you know, understated in terms of the sort of weirdness of sort of receiving this box of artifacts and opening up and finding not only printed ballots, but also like inaugural programs from, you know, Taft, and like we talked about the inaugural ball menus, which was also, so the whole world was sort of in front of me in a physical way, which just sort of added fuel to the fire to sort of keep going. And I remember when Vic and I first met, because I had so many questions about sort of process and why these things were, and meeting Victoria was like this godsend, sort of this missing link in terms of being able to talk about sort of the context and the more political science kind of background within which these operated. So I think we really enjoyed that. But it also helped that I was just looking for kind of cool stuff, not to diminish it, but I wasn't seeking out like a specific election race and trying to find that ballot. So it was more sort of what was available. But things like the pasters, that was buried in a box in New York Public Library. So it was sort of things that were sort of gifted to me as I sort of did my sleuthing around.
I'm going to give the last word to you, Victoria. What did you learn as somebody who's mainly focused on voting now when you started to work with Alicia on this book and work on this project?
You know, I think to me, one of the most amazing things was a lot of the questions and themes that are present in a ballot in 1820 or 1870 or 1920 is present today. We're still grappling with all of the same questions and dilemmas, issues of, you know, kind of corruption, competency, party power, voter intimidation, voter choice, the exuberance and hope of our democracy, and the kind of the anxieties of our democracy. When you take a look at these ballots from, you know, 1840 or 1850, you see the same themes as you might see kind of played out in a ballot today. And to me, that's sort of, there's something kind of gratifying about that, about knowing that our democracy has always been contested, and it's always been kind of difficult and hopeful, and that we've made it work so long, and we can keep making it work. That was the real pleasure to me.
Well, I think we should all get together and talk again, maybe in early November. I want to hear from all of you again at that point. That's where we have to leave it now. I want to thank our panelists, Larry Norden, Victoria Vassetti, and Alicia Cheng. Alicia, best of luck with your new book. It's called This Is What Democracy Looked Like, A Visual History of the Printed Ballot. We are also grateful to the partnership with the NYU Brennan Center and NYU Votes for collaborating on this program, and we encourage all students and all people who are eligible to vote. My name is Ilya Meritz. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and also just a little reminder from the Brennan Center, if you haven't done it already, please go complete your census form online at my2020census.gov. And if you can, sign up to vote by mail or participate in early voting in your state, please do that as well. And if you can't vote by mail or participate in early voting in your state, do call your local member of Congress and let them know that you want those options to protect your vote. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for everyone who made this happen and everyone who participated and supported the work of the Brennan Center for Justice. Thank you.